Okay, we're now going to look at theme 3D, which looks at the challenges from secularization. So what is this theme all about? Well, the secular refers to anything in society that is not connected to the religious. So we have the sacred, which is religious, and we have the secular, which is non-religious. And basically, what this theme is looking specifically is whether or not the UK is becoming more secular. Is it becoming less of a Christian country? Now, the theme uses the data from the 2011 National Census as well as other surveys to argue the case both for and against. You can interpret the data in different ways, and you've got to be able to refer to this data in an essay that you're doing. So all this PowerPoint does is provide information that can be used to argue both for and against whether we're becoming increasingly more secular or less secular. And as I said previously, you just need to know and refer to statistics from the census or the surveys that I'm going to quote in any evaluation on this theme, because you've got to make a decision whether you think we are more secular or whether the stuff from the census indicates slightly different things and can be interpreted differently. So without further ado, let's crack on. So let's start with this question. Is the UK a Christian country? Well, if you were a visitor to the UK, I think on first impressions you might well conclude that actually the UK is a Christian country. And what would your evidence be for this? Well, you could look around you and see the numerous church buildings that are there in every town and village. And they're not just Anglican Church of England churches, but there's also chapels and churches from various other denominations such as the Catholic, Methodist, Quaker, Unitarian, United Reformed Baptist, etc., etc., etc. Wherever you go, there's always some form of church. You could look at the geography of Britain. It's actually divided up into parishes in which the church plays a central role, and it has some sort of role in governing those parishes. Our language has been shaped by religious books such as the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. 30% of all our primary and secondary schools in some regions have some form of Christian affiliation. We have 26 bishops that sit in the House of Lords. We've got numerous TV and radio shows that reflect Christianity as being part of our culture, such as The Vicar of Dibley, Songs of Praise every Sunday. On Radio 4, there is a Thought for the Day. We have dedicated religious channels on satellite stations. And a lot of our most famous literary works reflect the key messages of Christianity. If we take the Narnia Chronicles, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, it is an entire allegory, a parable on Christianity. Tolkien, the writer of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, was a committed Catholic, and there are themes of redemption and sacrifice within his trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. And J.K. Rowling could certainly not have written the Harry Potter series without a deep knowledge of theology, philosophy, and indeed lengthy knowledge of religious studies. Harry Potter is ripe with interpretations from a philosophical and religious standpoint, and there are many other books as well, but I've named the ones that you might perhaps be more familiar with. So perhaps the UK is a Christian country, but it may well actually not be the case, because for a start, many churches have seen a dramatic decline in attendance on a Sunday. The 2011 census actually indicated that 59% of the population affiliated with Christianity. Here's the pie chart. You can see we've got 59% Christian, no religion at 25%, Muslim 5%, other 4%, not stated 7%. So 59%, that's a big chunk, but okay, it may suggest that over half the country consider themselves to be Christian. But that doesn't mean actually that 59% of the population actively participate in church. Now, another survey, the British Social Attitudes Survey, shows that actually less than 15% of the population report attending church services on a weekly basis. Now that number includes all religions, and it's possible that actually the number is inflated, so it might be even lower, since people tend to think they attend more than they do. So conservative estimate is that actually Christian attendance in churches is less than 5%, and attendance in the Church of England, traditionally the church of this country, has recently fallen to under 2%. So there you can see a line graph showing the average weekly church attendance, and since 2000, which was somewhere between 1.25 and 1.3 million, it's now moving down slowly on a trajectory in 2009, and it's been going down ever since. So let's think about that now. Is there enough evidence to say it is a Christian country or it isn't a Christian country? So let's look at that data from the census and the social attitude survey in more detail. So you could say that over half the population say they believe in God, but of course studies actually indicate that these beliefs, saying you believe in God, doesn't mean that you're necessarily following the traditional Christian notions of a belief in God, such as the dogma that's held in the Christian creed or the doctrine of the Trinity. A statement of a belief in God does not mean that you are specifically Christian or adhering to Christian beliefs. In the year 2000, an Orb survey commissioned for the BBC found that it might be more accurate to say that the population is less Christian but more spiritual. So the question they asked was, which of these would you say you are? And these were the answers they got. So these were the people that gave back the survey. 31% consider themselves to be spiritual people. 27% consider themselves to be religious. 10% agnostic. 7% not spiritual. 21% not a religious person, 8% a convinced atheist, and 5% don't know. Now, if you think about that now, we're really looking more at, in terms of religious, 27% of the population, not the 59% of the census. So what's the evidence for Christianity being on the decline and society becoming more secular? Well, let's look at some statistics. Before the start of the 20th century, it would have been normal to have undergone the major rites of passage in a church. I mean, baptism, weddings, funerals, that sort of thing. Now, increasingly, that is becoming rarer. So if we take the Church of England as an example, in 1950, 67% of the population were baptised. In 2011, it's only 12%. In 1957, 72% of all marriages in England and Wales were held in churches. By the year 2000, that's only 36.3%. And whilst religious funerals still remain relatively common, increasingly many families are now choosing to have a celebration of life instead, perhaps conducted by a representative from the British Humanist Association. The British Humanist Association does not hold a religious belief or a belief in God. And although you could argue that there are bishops in the House of Lords, actually increasingly British politicians are becoming silent about matters of religion. And if we take the argument of popular culture, there's at least as much evidence, if not more, of criticism of religion as there is of acceptance of it. So we could take, for instance, the controversy over Monty Python's Life of Brian, or Father Ted, or the fact that Richard Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, which advocated atheism and science over religion, was a national bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list for 51 consecutive weeks. And even the radio program Thought for the Day has an increasing number of presenters from religions other than Christianity, and there's increasing campaigns by humanists to be represented on that Thought for the Day as well. So maybe we are becoming more secular. So according to the census for England and Wales between 2001 and 2011, there's been a decline in those saying they belong to Christianity, and that's gone down from 72 to 59%, and an increase in those professing no religion from 15 to 25%. So the no religion has gone up and Christianity has gone down. And there's clearly a shift away from those who believe in a personal God towards those who prefer a less specific formulation. This is where we're talking about the spiritual here. And clearly over the last few decades, there's been a dramatic shift from what one can't do to what one can do on Sundays. Now, I am very old, but when I was a child, there was no Premiership football on a Sunday. There was no Test match cricket on a Sunday. And there were no shops open on a Sunday. The only shops that opened on a Sunday were newsagents for your Sunday paper, and they then closed at around about 11 o'clock in the morning. Absolutely nothing was open. You could not go and do anything on a Sunday. Now, I appreciate that you are much younger than you that are watching this, but that is the reality. And over my lifetime, what you can and can't do on a Sunday has changed dramatically. So a strong argument there for secularization within society. It would be also true to say that churches are increasingly being turned into things like commercial spaces or flats and dwellings, or even being taken over by other religions, changed into temples and mosques. So there's a decline in the use of our church buildings for what they were originally intended for. And also, it's really clear that atheism and humanism are now presented more widely in British schools. As a religious studies teacher, I would teach about atheism and humanism, and indeed atheism and the challenge from atheism to Christianity is a unit in this A-level. Now, the British Social Attitudes Survey also reveals that for every single convert into the Church of England, they lose 12 out of the Church of England, mainly through death. And what this bar chart shows you up here, increasingly, if you look at Sunday attendance in the Church of England, look at the demographic in terms of the age of the congregation. So what you're seeing in certainly the Church of England is an increasingly older population which are gradually dying out and not being filled up by the younger generation whatsoever. If we're looking 15 to 29, very few people attending whatsoever. And look at how small it is in 2015. So the age is massive. We're looking at the blue bar here. It's massive, but tiny, younger and young people, hardly representative, older people dying out. So, is it on the decline? Let's look at evidence against. Well, some studies have shown that the numbers are actually growing at things like cathedrals, amongst worshippers and pilgrims coming to visit, and tourists and visitors, etc. And it's still relatively rare for someone to die without some form of religious ceremony, so that could be an argument against secularization. Also true to say that there's a Christian presence through chaplains in many areas of our social life, in the healthcare, in hospitals, in the prison service, in the armed services, higher education. There is a Christian chaplain presence. And also other studies, such as the one done by the AHRC and the ESRC in 2010-11, showed that actually just over 50% of undergraduate students self-identified as Christians. 55.7% think of themselves as religious or spiritual, 33.1% are neither, and 11.2% didn't know. So maybe the numbers are skewed slightly. And there's increasingly popular Christian festivals. So whereas Glastonbury is your bog standard biannual church standard music festival, there are other Christian festivals such as Greenbelt, Spring Harvest, New Wine, Soul Survivor that are increasingly popular and extremely well attended. So maybe it isn't as much on the decline as we think. And of course, 77% of the British believe that there are things in life you simply cannot explain through science or any other means, and only 18% of our population disagree with that statement. So there's still this element of religion explaining the unexplained. So maybe not as secular as we first thought. So I'm now going to spend some time looking at this part of the census where we had 25% of the population saying that they had no religion, because this is quite significant. So many people believe that the census figure of 25% actually underestimates the true number. And they point to the fact that the question used in the census led people, when they answered the question, to give a positive answer, because the question they asked was, what is your religion? And that question assumes automatically that someone has a religion. Now, the British Social Attitudes Survey asked a slightly different question and got a different response. They asked, do you regard yourself as belonging to any particular religion? Now, in 2013, this led to over half of those surveyed as saying no. So 50.6 up from 31.4. So that 50.6 does not appear to marry up with the 25% of the 2011 census. So maybe it was the way that the question was couched that led to that lower finding of no religion. And actually, if they've worded it a different way, they've got a more realistic way of looking at it, of 50.6. Now, the textbook refers to this figure, but actually there has been another British Social Attitude Survey since the textbook was published, and the figure has risen now to 52%. So 1983 it was 31.4, up to 50.6 in 2013, and now at 52%. Now, you could conclude that as it hasn't dramatically risen that much over 6 years, maybe that figure is starting to stabilise and plateau, and maybe actually in terms of our population it is around half the population hold no religion, and it's going to stay that way. Now, what's quite interesting is you can also look at religious identity. So here are the three, so you've got the 1983, 2008 and 2018, and you can see how the Church of England is going downwards, Roman Catholics are going downwards, but other no denomination Christians are on the up. So it may be that actually the Church of England isn't doing very well, but other more charismatic denominations are doing better. Okay, so that gives you some idea of how the populations see themselves. So more grist to the mill there. So here are some of the findings of that 2019 survey, and I just put these in because I think they summarise what that survey was saying. And so the first quote I've got here is that wider research suggests that Britain's becoming more secular, not because adults are losing their religion or inclination to practice, but because old people with an attachment to the Church of England and other Christian denominations are gradually being replaced in the population by unaffiliated younger people. So that seems to marry with what we said about the Church of England, the demographic being much older and people dying out and not being replaced. So to put it another way, religious decline in Britain is generational. People tend to be less religious than their parents. On average, their children are even less religious than they are. So if you have two non-religious parents, they're probably going to successfully transmit their lack of religion to their children. Two religious parents have got roughly a 50-50 chance of passing on the faith, and one religious parent does only half as well as two together. So Vose and Crockett state, to borrow the terminology of radioactive decay, institutional religion in Britain now has a half-life of one generation. Now, it's talking about institutional, so that's more about Catholicism, Church of England. The other interesting summary from the Social Attitudes Survey is this. It puts, in summary, the proportion of British population who identify as Christian has fallen dramatically over the last 3 decades, with most of the decline being in those who identify as Anglican. So the decline's happened in the Church of England. Some people move away from the faith of their family or childhood, but also an increasing proportion of younger people are not brought up in a religion. So they then state that the collapse of Anglican Church of England affiliation is even more strikingly demonstrated when viewed by age group. A third, 33% of respondents who are aged 75 and above, regard themselves as Anglican. So if you ask anyone that's over 75, a third of the respondents will say, I'm Church of England. If you ask the same question to people in the 18 to 24 age group, almost none answer. 1% answer Church of England. So it's really clear, certainly I think you can't argue it any other way, that the Church of England is definitely on the decline. Doesn't necessarily mean that Christianity is, it just means that denomination is. And that brings us on to this lady, Linda Woodhead, who is a sociologist at, I think, Lancaster University. And she has delved a little deeper into this idea of what this no religion means when people put it on the census. So she dug a little deeper into the category, and she says that it looks like 18 to 24-year-olds make up 60% of this no religion, with only 27% of them adhering to Christianity in that age group. And obviously, as you go older, it's 34% of those who are 60 and older declaring no religion, with 60% of this age group stating that they adhere to Christianity. So what it appears to show is that no religion is expanding as Christianity is diminishing. So the people that were previously making up the percentage of Christianity as being high in this country, as Christianity has gone down, no religion has gone up. That would seem to suggest we are becoming more secular. However, Woodford shows that less than half of the category are actually atheists. So the people that say they have no religion don't say they're atheists. Only half of them, well, 41%, say they're atheists. So even though we're looking at a rise in secularization, is it actually the case? They say there's no religion, but they still don't say they don't believe in God. So there is some religion there. Okay. The largest group is composed of those who doubt the existence of God or think that maybe God exists. So what's even more interesting is that if you look at those people in no religion that have answered that no religion, only a very small minority, 13.5%, are actually hostile to public forms of religion, such as faith schools and religious belief. And actually many people in that category have very positive opinions of religious leaders, such as the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, Pope Francis. And about a quarter of those in that category even report taking part in some form of religious or spiritual practice, at least monthly, such as praying. So they said no religion, but they still, a quarter of them, take part in some sort of religious practice. So it's not always, every single answer is not as it first seems. So Woodhead's analysis is interesting. So what she thinks is what binds this group together is not therefore hostility to Christianity or indeed religion, but simply the fact that they are not part of a religious community. So whereas some people go, I belong to the C of E, I belong to the Catholic Church, they are religious but don't belong to a specific church or community. And that then leads us on to the issue of faith schools, which has been increasingly in the press over the past few years. And faith schools were on the up in the previous Conservative government, and there's been a lot of debate as to whether these are fair or not. So let's take some time to look at faith schools, because this adds further argument to secularization or not. So we have many primary and secondary faith schools that are affiliated with a religious tradition. It may well be that you went to a Church of England primary school. In Plymouth we have some secondary schools that are linked to the Catholic Church. Most faith schools in this country are affiliated with Christianity, but there are other faith schools that are affiliated to Islam, Judaism, etc. And in some regions of the UK, 30% of the schools in the region are faith schools, so it can be a very high percentage. And faith schools receive some of their funding from religious organisations. So the organisation may, for instance, own the school buildings and the land. Certainly faith schools will appoint a certain number of schools governors to represent the religious ethos. So for instance, my mother's local primary school is a Church of England primary school and is linked to the local church. My mother was a church warden at the church and was therefore made a governor at the primary school, because it reflects the Christian tradition of that primary school, and my mother is a Christian. So what's interesting then is when it comes to a faith school, it's the governors rather than the local authority that are responsible for the school's admission policy and also for appointing staff. Now, some of the criticism has been that what then happens is that they give preference, they hire teachers and staff that adhere to the same religious beliefs that they do. So some people have claimed what you get then is a bias. Okay, and this little chart shows you what percentage of people are educated in the faith school sector. So you can see within secondary it's about 15%, but in primaries it's much higher. And you can look at that data as time goes on. So, right or wrong, faith schools? Well, one of the criticisms, as I've said, is admissions. Some Christian faith schools might prioritise students who are affiliated with the school's faith. They may, and indeed they do, they might ask for a proof of that they are Christian. Have you got a Baptist, a certificate that you've been baptised? Or have you got a letter from the local priest that your parents attend worship to strengthen their application? Now, what sometimes happens is you just, because parents want to get their children into that school, they end up attending church simply to get a place at the school. They're not attending church because they hold any particular religious belief. They just want to get their kids into the local school. So, you end up with these families attending church simply to get a place at the school. But that also means that's to the detriment of other students who live in the area and can't get into their local school because they don't have the same religious affiliation. Now, increasingly, because of this criticism, many faith schools have actually removed that faith criteria from their admissions policy to avoid the issue and to avoid the criticism. That doesn't mean that they've all done it. Some still hold to that. Obviously, faith schools still have to follow the national curriculum in all subjects. However, in religious studies, the schools are actually allowed to focus specifically on their religious tradition. Though many still do present other religions and they still have to be inspected by Ofsted, but you can focus much more on the faith of your religion. In RE, we do all world religions, but certainly when I was applying for jobs, all the well-paid jobs in RE many years ago, the big money was as head of RE in a Catholic school, and you couldn't apply unless you were a Catholic, and as I'm not a Catholic, I never applied. Increasingly, that's not the case, but it was certainly at the start of my career. So those who support faith schools point to several advantages. So they say, well, parents who want their children to have a religious ground in their education can have this need met. Faith schools tend to be amongst the best performing state schools. They add an element of diversity and choice to the educational landscape, and the values and ethics of the religious tradition these schools represent foster things that we want from our children, such as inclusivity, tolerance, love and justice. But the British Humanist Association actively campaigns against faith schools. It doesn't like them. It invites the public to petition the government against the creation of new faith schools and urges the existing faith schools to become more inclusive. Because they believe that by their very nature, faith schools contradict the principle of a fully inclusive and integrated education system that doesn't exclude staff or students or governors based on their belief. So in other words, they believe that faith schools create a segregated future, and they would argue that public funds shouldn't be used to promote religion. And that increasing campaign against faith schools might suggest, again, that we are becoming more secular as a society. And they've raised a number of objections in relation to the curriculum at faith schools. So they said, all right, let's look at the teaching of RE in faith schools. Ofsted don't look at that. They only look at the rest of the curriculum. So that's an issue. So they would argue that religious education aims to instruct children in doctrine and practice of a particular religion rather than taking a much more objective approach. It's preaching, not teaching, they would argue. They say that RE in faith schools doesn't cover other religions and certainly fails to give a fair account of non-religious views such as atheism or humanism. They have grave misgivings on ethical issues such as abortion or assisted dying, which might be approached from an explicitly religious perspective within an RE lesson. So you are told abortion is wrong, euthanasia is wrong, because that's what the religion says. And certainly PSHE might teach that sex and relationship components in a way that's homophobic or gender discriminatory, given what is said in the Bible specifically about homosexuality and the role of women. So those are some of the issues that the Humanists Association has with faith schools. You make your own opinion up as to whether you think they're right or wrong. And finally, and this is in a few, and only a few, of the really, really small ultra-evangelical schools that are linked to Christianity, some faith schools have actually taught creationism and intelligent design as a scientific theory, and almost within science lessons. And that is a major issue for quite a few people in this country. So, faith schools, right or wrong? Well, there's one other thing I want to do on faith schools. So, how important is faith in faith schools? Well, actually, interestingly, when you look at parents, many say their main motivation to sending their children to faith schools has got very little to do with the religious element whatsoever. So Linda Woodhead looked at the reasons why parents choose or hypothetically choose a faith school. Here are the reasons. 70%, the main reason was academic standards. 58% location. 41% were there for the discipline. 23% for the ethical values, the prestige of the school, 90% of parents, and right at the bottom, 5% sent their kids to do because of the exposure to the faith tradition, and only 3% to transmit a belief about God. Now, if you look at this diagram here, what you see that in non-faith schools, if we take free school meals, the poorer members of society are in the non-faith schools compared to the faith schools. And if we talk about prior attainment, in fact, what they've done better in terms of the kids are more academically able, again, much more able in a faith school, much less able in a non-faith school. So maybe the view that your religious element of the faith school plays very little part in the reasoning of parents choosing it. Perhaps it's got much more to do with the results of the school and the pupils' backgrounds, and that's why the parents send them to a faith school. It's got nothing to do with religion whatsoever. I think that's a much more interesting conclusion to come to. So I'm now going to look at some case studies that can be used to argue for and against Britain becoming increasingly more secular. First one we'll look at is the ban on the Lord's Prayer at Star Wars. So in 2015, the Church of England produced an advertisement that they intended to have shown in cinemas right at the beginning before The Force Awakens was screened. And the ad shows several people in different settings basically saying the Lord's Prayer. And if you want to go and look at that ad, there is a link to it there. If you copy that link, or you can't paste it from YouTube, but copy it, you can see that YouTube clip, or if you just search Church of England Lord's Prayer ad, you will get it, so you can see what I'm referring to. Basically, they put the ad together, and then the digital cinema media banned the ad from being shown in cinemas because they claimed it transgressed their policy of not promoting ads with political or religious messages. They thought the ad would offend people of differing faiths or no faith, and actually that caused an outcry from several leaders and personalities, Prime Minister David Cameron, and even atheist actors such as Stephen Fry came out and argued that the ad should have been screened. The Equality and Human Rights Commission spoke in favour of the ad, saying there's nothing in the law that prevents Christian organisation promoting their faith through adverts. So it's interesting that people felt that way. But just as people argued for the ad, many disagreed, saying the public didn't want religions preaching to them. So it could be argued that the decision to ban the ad reflects the decreasing influence of Christianity in Britain, or you could argue, on the other hand, that the outcry against its banning might suggest the contrary. You choose to use this as you want. So we then move on to the case study of this lady here, and this is the controversy that started over whether or not it was illegal to wear a crucifix. So in 2006, British Airways suspended Nadia Awida because she wouldn't cover up a crucifix whilst at work. BA claimed it contravened their uniform policy for jewellery, although the company did allow hijabs and turbans to be worn. And then in 2007, BA changed their rules, allowing Miss Awida to wear a symbol of faith, but they refused to pay her for her period of suspension. Now, as a result of that, she and 3 other Christians, and the next slide I'll show you their cases, brought a case against the UK government for not protecting their rights. Now, in her case, she argued, or the UK argued, that actually wearing a crucifix is not a requirement of Christianity, and that therefore this reflected only the personal belief rather than disadvantaging the group. So whereas in Sikhism a turban is a requirement for people to wear, and in Islam a hijab is a requirement, the crucifix is not a requirement in Christianity. That is how the UK argued it. She took her case to the European Court of Human Rights, and they heard her case at the same time with 3 other cases which we'll look at now. So the first case that was heard along with her was one of this lady here, Shirley Chaplin. She was a nurse, and her employer stopped her wearing necklaces with a cross because they argued it would be unsafe around patients and possibly spread disease. So that was her case being held. Along with that, we had this guy here, Gary McFarlane. He was a marriage counsellor for the group Relate, and he was dismissed from Relate for saying he would object to giving sex therapy advice to gay couples. It contravened his Christian belief. And then finally, this lady here, Lillian Ladili, who was a registrar for a local authority, and she was disciplined because she refused to conduct same-sex civil partnership ceremonies, even though she was employed as a registrar. So all these 3 went along with the British Airways crucifix case to the European Court. There's the headline. Thank you, Jesus. BA Checking Clark finally wins her court battle. Yes, she did win her case. The European Court of Human Rights declared in these circumstances, where there's no evidence of any real encroachment on the interests of others, the domestic authorities failed significantly to protect the applicant's right to manifest her religion. So they argued it's not harming anyone else, therefore she should have been protected. David Cameron, the Prime Minister at the time, said he was delighted with the principle of wearing religious symbols at work was being upheld, adding that people shouldn't suffer discrimination due to religious beliefs. But, you know, her case hinged on the fact that her cross was discreet and didn't adversely affect BA's corporate image. Significantly, though, the other 3, their cases weren't successful because the ECHR argued that actually it did affect other people. So therefore, the case wasn't upheld. So those 3 were all rejected. So that is significant. We then move on to the outcry over same-sex civil partnerships. These people here are Hazel Mary and Peter Bull. They own a hotel in Cornwall. In 2008, they refused to let civil partners Stephen Preedy and Martin Hall stay in a room because they based their decision on their Christian beliefs. And they said, we're ordinary Christians who believe in the importance of marriage as the union of one man and one woman. Our B&B is not just our business, it's our home. All we've tried to do is live according to our own values under our own roof. Their court case was based on their right to manifest their religion, practice their religion, under the European Court of Human Rights. Again, the court found that actually they acted unlawfully and they were ordered to pay damage to the couple. The Supreme Court upheld this decision after an appeal, and it affirmed the rights of all people to have relationships with others regardless of sexual orientation. Now, the homosexual rights group Stonewall suggested it might have been more Christian for the bulls to have fought the evils of poverty and disease worldwide than to have gone through with this case. And it's interesting that many Christians in Great Britain have actually reinterpreted the Bible in such a way as to support acceptance of homosexual relationships. Surveys show that whereas in 1989 most Christians disagreed with same-sex marriage, 70 to 80% in 1989, by 2014 this had fallen to less than 30%. So it would appear that the bulls are in the minority in this case. So this dramatic change in belief means that the bulls now represent a minority position amongst those who call themselves Christians in Britain, shows the changing way that Christianity is adapting to modern society, but also the fact that the European Court didn't uphold their case also suggests possibly secularization. Up to you to make your decision on that. Next one we are going to look at is just the general view of secularization of society. So we know that secularization is the process by which a society once dominated by religious institutions becomes more non-religious. Okay, and I think few would deny that there has been a process of secularization at work in the UK. And you can see that in terms of the church, church declining in several areas such as attendance, less rituals being performed, less influence in government and society. And of course there's disagreement as to whether this secularization is a good thing or not. So those who are committed to the ideology of secularization will obviously see it as a good thing, because they think that religion is otherworldly and that a less religious focus in society brings about a more humane society. So those who embrace secularism believe that it's both natural and good that society should become secular. So it's not uncommon to see arguments that Christianity and religion are associated with superstition and violence and authority and monarchy and control and repression and intolerance. And of course science is associated with progress and peace and humanity and tolerance and democracy. And those are the sorts of arguments you get from those who uphold the secular. So the assumption that some secularists make is that the more modern society becomes, the less religious it will be. In other words, one can't be modern and religious at the same time. So does that mean that Christianity is merely a relic from the past? Well, I think you could argue no, because increasingly in our modern society, many people are disillusioned with modern science. Prosperity and healthcare haven't delivered for all. We've still got famine, we've still got global warming, we've still got the threat of nuclear warfare. You could also argue that there aren't always strong boundaries between science and religion. For instance, if you take the example of the Occupy movement, which was trying to protest against the excesses of global capitalism, that movement moved from Fleet Street to the grounds of St Paul's Cathedral. Why did it do that? Well, it was hoping the church would be an ally with their cause. So some of the protesters asked, what would Jesus do? And of course the campaign for nuclear disarmament is just another example of a social cause that brings both believers and those with no religion together. I think you could also argue that the decline, and I think this is a key argument, the decline in church membership, or what we're seeing in the decline in church membership, is a movement from religion as duty, where you were expected to go to church, whether you believed or not, you just went out of duty, and obligation, to actually religion becoming a real choice for people. So even though that may mean fewer numbers in church, it may also mean that those who believe and practice their faith may find it more meaningful. So actually the core number of Christians who actually really believe hasn't really changed. It's just church attendance that's changed. It's the same way that you can look at statistics about, let's say, divorce. So we have a much higher divorce rate now than we ever had, let's say, going back to the 1960s and 70s. Does that mean that there are more unhappy marriages now than in the 1960s and 70s? No, it doesn't. It was just much harder to get divorced in the 1960s and 70s. We have lower church attendance now. Is that because we have less Christians, or does it mean that having to go to church is seen as less important. When I was at school, the expectation, I went to a boarding school, the expectation was you went to church every single Sunday. That was what one had to do. Does that happen anymore? I suspect not. So maybe it's not Christianity that's on decline, it's church attendance, and it's the attendance of people that never believed in the first place. You can work what you want out of that. Interesting view though. And of course, there are several Christian initiatives that actually might be seen as progressive and positive and modern and still reflect the key values of the religion. And I'm using here the street pastor movement, which is a church response to urban needs, where volunteers are trained to provide a positive and helpful presence on the streets of UK cities on a Friday and Saturday night, offering a helping hand, a listening ear, practical help. So their mission is listening, caring and helping. And you've got street pastors that work in over 300 towns and cities across the UK, and over 20,000 volunteers are associated with this initiative. Is that a bad thing? I suspect not. So you can interpret all these, so those who are secularist might interpret all these points as the last gasps of a dying religion. But of course, others are not so convinced. And in my final slide, we look at these two sociologists from Warwick University, Elizabeth Arweck and James A. Beckford, who named 6 factors that committed secularists may want to consider before they reach the conclusion that Christianity is just a relic of the past. They talk about religious vitality, that religion continues to be popular for many in different forms, including but not limited to charismatic expressions, cathedral worship, of various forms of spirituality. It's not dead, it has just changed. We've got the whole nature of modernity. There are different ways of being modern. Many modern people see religion as a resource for modern living when science doesn't provide all the solutions. They talk about deprivatization, the idea that seeing religion not as a private personal belief, but that religion has helped to bring about positive social change for lots of people getting out there, like the street pastor movement. We look at globalization. There are transnational religious movements which focus on faith or human rights across the world, and that gives Christianity a boost in some locations. They also focus on gender, because Christianity has a wide range of views on women's roles in leadership, and the Christian community, which might explain the success or failure of various individual denominations and churches and forms of spirituality due to their attitude to women. Those that are more liberal and more encompassing of women are perhaps being more successful than ones who traditionally are not so forthcoming with women. Take it as you want. And then finally, they talk about rational choice, which is the suggestion that religion's a market that thrives when state regulation in the form of established church is lower. So this suggests that the decline of the state church is not the same as the decline in Christianity. So whereas the Church of England may have dropped off, that is our state church, it doesn't mean that Christianity has. People have moved to different churches, etc., etc. So a myriad of different arguments against, for and against the secularization. Hopefully you've got a broad idea of what there is out there and how you can argue this. Hopefully you found that useful.